A ruthless Mafia don hands his unlimited black card to a homeless mother in a freezing subway station, only to be left in shock by the notifications on his phone. What she buys will force a killer to question everything. Dante Vallo stood at the apex of a world built on bone and bullet casings. From his penthouse atop the Vallo Tower, the city of Boston looked like a shimmering circuit board, a grid of lives he influenced, taxed, or ended with a single word. The glass walls of his office stretched from floor to ceiling, offering a panoramic view of the harbor, but the interior was a vacuum of warmth. There were no family photographs on his mahogany desk, no mementos of a life lived for pleasure. There was only the cold, sharp scent of expensive cologne and the rhythmic ticking of a Patek Philippe watch that cost more than a suburban home. To Dante, the silence of the penthouse wasn't peaceful. It was a fortress. It was the expensive emptiness his father, Silvio Vallo, had promised him was the only true safety a man in their position could ever know. Dante poured himself a glass of neat scotch, the amber liquid catching the moonlight. He was 38 years old, a man in his prime, yet he felt like an ancient relic of a war that never ended. His father's voice still echoed in the marble hallways of his mind, a gravelly ghost that never slept. "Mercy is a death sentence, Dante," Silvio would say, his hand heavy on a young Dante's shoulder. "The moment you feel pity, you've handed your enemy the knife. And remember this: the poor are the most dangerous of all. They are bottomless pits of need. Give them a crumb, and they will wait until you sleep to take the loaf. Desperation doesn't make saints, boy. It makes thieves who have nothing to lose." This was the gospel of the Vallo Syndicate. For 3 decades, Dante had lived by it. He had seen the way men begged for their lives and then reached for a hidden gun the moment his back was turned. He had watched loyal lieutenants sell secrets for a chance at a better life, proving his father's theory that every person had a price and most prices were insultingly low. Because of this, Dante's life was a masterclass in isolation. He didn't have friends. He had assets. He didn't have a home. He had a high-security perimeter. His wealth, estimated in the hundreds of millions across offshore accounts and legitimate fronts, was a scoreboard for a game he had stopped enjoying years ago. He was the king of a mountain of ash, looking down at a world he had been taught to despise. He walked to the window, watching the snow begin to swirl against the glass. The city was entering the grip of a brutal January cold snap, the kind of weather that killed the weak and hardened the strong. Down there, in the shadows of the skyscrapers, people were shivering, fighting for space over subway grates, and huddling in doorways. Dante felt nothing for them. To him, they were just variables in an equation of urban decay. He had been trained to look at a crowd and see only threats or opportunities. Empathy had been pruned from his psyche like a diseased limb until only the cold, hard wood of survival remained. The security monitors on his wall flickered. His lead enforcer, Marco, appeared in the doorway, a shadow among shadows. "The meeting with the Moretti faction is set for tomorrow morning. Don Dante. Back Bay Station, 6 a.m. They want it neutral, public enough to prevent a hit, but early enough to avoid witnesses." Dante nodded, his face a mask of granite. The Morettis were encroaching on the northern docks, a territorial dispute that had already cost 4 lives. He would meet them, not because he feared them, but because he needed to remind them who owned the air they breathed. As Marco left, Dante turned back to the dark expanse of the harbor. He thought about the black card tucked into his wallet, a piece of titanium that represented absolute, unfettered power. It had bought politicians, silenced witnesses, and fueled a lifestyle of decadent excess that he found increasingly hollow. He had everything he could ever want, yet he woke up every morning with a phantom weight on his chest, a sense that he was a man drowning in a shallow pool of his own making. He was the most powerful man in the city, yet he was a prisoner of his own distrust. His father had been right about the danger of the world, but he hadn't mentioned the cost of the safety. The cost was the soul. Dante looked at his reflection in the glass. The sharp jawline, the eyes that hadn't truly smiled since he was a boy, and the stillness of a predator. He was the perfect product of the Volo legacy. He was the expensive emptiness incarnate. He had spent 38 years building a fortress that no one could breach, only to realize that he had accidentally locked himself inside with no way out. Tomorrow he would step out into the cold to face his enemies, unaware that the real challenge to his empire wouldn't come from a rival's bullet but from the one thing his father had never prepared him for: the sight of a mother's love in the ruins of the world. The morning air at Back Bay Station was a physical assault, a blade of ice that sliced through even the finest cashmere. Dante Volo moved through the terminal with the silent, rhythmic gait of a predator, his presence carving a wake through the early morning commuters. Behind him, Marco and two other men trailed at a discreet distance, their eyes scanning the rafters and the dark alcoves of the station for the Moretti contingency. To any observer, Dante was the image of untouchable power, but internally, he was a coiled spring. The neutral ground of the subway station felt like a tomb, echoing, damp, and smelling of stale electricity and old rain. As he neared the designated meeting point near the Orange Line tracks, a flash of movement in the shadows caught his peripheral vision. His hand instinctively twitched toward the holster beneath his coat, but he stalled. It wasn't an assassin. Huddled against a grime-streaked pillar was a woman who looked like she was being slowly erased by the city. She wore a thin, threadbare jacket that offered no protection against the subterranean draft, and her hands were raw and red from the cold. But it wasn't her poverty that stopped Dante in his tracks. It was the way she was positioned. She was crouched on the concrete floor, her body arched like a human shield over a small, sleeping boy. This was Elena Rossi. She didn't look like the dangerous thief his father had warned him about. She looked like a fortress of flesh and bone, a woman who had long ago traded her own comfort, her own warmth, and perhaps her own dignity to ensure the small heartbeat beneath her remained steady. Her eyes, sunken and shadowed by a bone-deep exhaustion, met Dante's for a fleeting second. In that moment, he didn't see the greed he expected. He saw a terrifying, feral clarity. She wasn't looking for a handout. She was looking for a way to survive the next 10 minutes. "Don Dante," Marco whispered, stepping up beside him, his voice tense. "The Morettis are arriving. We shouldn't linger here. This area is too open." Dante didn't move. He was mesmerized by the child, Leo, who was clutching a worn stuffed elephant, his small face tucked into the crook of his mother's neck. The boy was shivering in his sleep. Dante thought of his own childhood, the silk sheets, the heated floors, and the absolute lack of the kind of protective warmth Elena was currently radiating. He had been given everything money could buy and nothing that this child possessed in the middle of a freezing subway station. "Wait," Dante commanded, his voice a low rasp that silenced his men. He watched as Elena tried to adjust her position, her limbs stiff from the cold. She didn't approach him. She didn't hold out a cup or a cardboard sign. She simply held her son tighter, her gaze dropping back to the floor as if trying to make herself invisible to the powerful men in tailored suits. To Dante, she was a living contradiction of his father's gospel. If the poor were truly bottomless pits of need, why wasn't she begging? If they were inherent manipulators, why did she look so shattered by the weight of her own integrity? The Moretti brothers appeared 50 yards away, for men in heavy overcoats, their faces obscured by the dim station lighting. The air grew thick with the threat of violence. This was the moment where Dante should have focused on the business of the syndicate, on the territorial lines and the cost of the docks. Instead, he felt a sudden, violent revulsion for the game he had been playing. The millions of dollars he was about to argue over felt like monopoly money compared to the life-and-death struggle happening at the base of the pillar. "They're late," Dante muttered, though they were exactly on time. He reached into his inner pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold, hard titanium of his black card. He stepped toward Elena. Marco moved to intercept him, his face pale. "Boss, what are you doing? We're in the middle of a sit-down." "Back off, Marco," Dante snapped, the authority in his voice cutting like a whip. He stood over Elena, his shadow engulfing her. She flinched, her arms tightening around Leo, her eyes darting to the men behind Dante. She saw the bulge of their weapons and the hardness of their expressions, and she clearly prepared for the worst. She expected a kick, an insult, or to be told to move along so the important people could conduct their business. Instead, Dante knelt. The movement was awkward for a man who never bowed to anyone, his $8,000 coat dragging on the filthy station floor. He didn't say a word. He simply pulled the card from his wallet and held it out to her. Elena looked at the card, then up at him, her confusion overriding her fear. I don't have change, sir," she whispered, her voice cracked and thin. "It's not for change," Dante said, his voice surprisingly steady. "It's a key. You have 24 hours. Buy what you need. Buy what he needs. No limits. No questions." He saw the flicker of disbelief in her eyes, followed by a surge of suspicion. She looked at the card as if it were a trap, a weapon of wealth, designed to catch her in a lie. For a second, Dante expected her to throw it back at him, to scream that she couldn't be bought. But then, Leo whimpered in his sleep, a small pained sound of cold, and Elena's hand reached out. Her fingers, trembling and scarred by the winter, brushed against his as she took the card. Dante stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way that a gunfight had never managed to achieve. He turned his back on her before she could thank him, or before he could change his mind. He walked toward the Moretti brothers, who were watching the exchange with baffled, narrowed eyes. "Is there a problem, Volo?" The eldest Moretti called out, his hand resting in his pocket. Dante didn't even look at him. He looked at the security camera mounted on the pillar above Elena, knowing his team could track every cent spent on that card from his phone. "The meeting is over," Dante said, passing the Morettis without stopping. "I have a more interesting investment to monitor." As he walked toward the exit, leaving his confused enforcers and his rivals behind, Dante felt the cold air hit his face. For the first time in 38 years, he wasn't thinking about the syndicate. He was thinking about a notification. He was waiting for the first crack in the fortress he had built around his soul. Dante Volo sat in the back of his armored Maybach, the silence of the cabin pressurized by the unspoken questions of his men. Outside, the city of Boston blurred into a smear of gray and white, but Dante's focus was entirely on the slim smartphone cradled in his palm. He had activated the real-time alert system for his primary black card. In his world, that card was usually a weapon. It was used to buy silence, to pay off crooked precinct captains, or to fund the logistical nightmares of international smuggling. Giving it to Elena Rossi was, by his father's logic, like handing a loaded gun to an enemy and asking them not to shoot. "Boss," Marco said from the front seat, unable to contain himself any longer. "With all due respect, that card is linked to the offshore accounts. If she's smart, she's already at a high-end jeweler's in the Back Bay, cashing out. She could drain $500,000 before we even get the fraud department on the line. Why give it to her? She's a ghost. We'll never find her again." Dante didn't look up. "That's the point, Marco. My father always said the poor are driven by an evolutionary greed. He said that if you give a beggar the keys to the kingdom, they'll burn the palace down just to sell the scrap metal. I want to see the fire." But deep down, Dante was lying. He didn't want to see a fire. For the first time in his life, he was desperate to be proven wrong. He wanted Elena to be something other than a thief. He wanted her to be the glitch in the cold mechanical universe his father had built for him. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The phone remained silent. Dante felt a strange tightening sensation in his chest. Was she fleeing? Was she already at a bus terminal, heading for the border? Then, the first haptic buzz vibrated against his thumb. He swiped the screen, his eyes narrowing. Transaction. CVS Pharmacy. $42.87. Dante stared at the number. $42. In the world of the Volo Syndicate, $42 was the tip he gave a valet for not scratching his car. It was nothing. He waited for the next one, expecting the real spending to begin. Transaction. Payless Chaussures. $65.12. Transaction. Whole Foods Market. $112.04. She's buying groceries, Dante whispered to himself, the words feeling heavy on his tongue. What was that, boss? Marco asked. Nothing. Keep driving. Dante leaned back against the leather upholstery, closing his eyes. He tried to imagine Elena in the store. He saw her walking through the aisles of the supermarket, not headed for the caviar or the top-shelf liquor, but for the milk, the bread, and the heavy plastic bottles of orange juice. He imagined her in the shoe store, measuring Leo's feet, picking out boots that were thick enough to withstand the slush of the Boston gutters. Each notification was a small, rhythmic hammer blow against the fortress of his cynicism. By noon, the total spent was less than $300. It was a staggering display of restraint that Dante couldn't comprehend. He had given her a weapon of wealth capable of changing her life forever. She could have bought a car, a watch, or a suitcase full of designer clothes to resell. Instead, she was treating the card like a lifeline, using it only to keep her son's heart beating. Dante's mind drifted back to a memory he usually kept buried in the dark corners of his psyche. He was 7 years old, sitting in the back of a similar car, watching his father hand a roll of $100 bills to a man who had done a favor for the family. The man had groveled, kissing Silvio Volo's ring, his eyes bright with a hungry, desperate gluttony. That was the only version of the poor Dante they had ever known, the ones who traded their souls for a taste of the Volo gold. Elena was different. She wasn't groveling. She wasn't even there to thank him. She was out there in the cold, moving through the city with his power in her pocket, and she was choosing to be invisible. She chose to be a mother instead of a beneficiary. Marco, pull over, Dante commanded suddenly. Here. We're in the middle of the financial district, boss. Pull over. Dante stepped out into the biting wind, leaving his security detail confused in the idling car. He walked toward a small park where a few statues of long-dead patriots stood covered in bird droppings and snow. He needed the cold. He needed to feel the sting on his skin because the warmth spreading through his chest was terrifying. It was the feeling of a mercy he had been told was a death sentence. He looked at his phone again. A new notification appeared. Transaction. The Children's Place. $88.40. He could almost see it, the new coat, the wool hat, and the thick socks for Leo. He felt a lump form in his throat, a physical manifestation of a crack in his soul. He had spent his entire life accumulating power so that no one could ever hurt him, only to realize that he had never felt as powerful as he did right now, watching a woman spend $88 on a child's jacket. This was the true weapon of wealth, he realized. It wasn't the ability to destroy or to bribe. It was the ability to provide a shield for the vulnerable. He had been using his money to build walls. Elena was using it to build a future, one small transaction at a time. As he stood in the snow, the Mafia Don felt a strange sense of vertigo. If his father was wrong about the poor, what else was he wrong about? If mercy wasn't a death sentence, what was it? Dante Volo, a man who had ordered hits and commanded a small army, felt a tear prick at the corner of his eye, not from the cold, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that he had been a billionaire in a cage of his own making, and a homeless woman was currently holding the key. Night fell over Boston like an inkwell tipped across a white linen sheet, but the fortress of Dante Vallo's penthouse remained ablaze with artificial light. Dante had dismissed his security detail to the lower levels, needing the solitude to process the silent conversation happening through his smartphone. He sat in his leather armchair, the only light in the room emanating from the screen that had become his window into the soul of a woman he barely knew. The digital trail left by Elena Rossi was a map of survival. Most people, when handed a syndicate boss's black card, would have left a trail of fire. Luxury hotels, high-end electronics, perhaps a rental car to put as many miles between themselves and the South End as possible. But Elena was moving with the surgical precision of a woman who knew exactly what her son needed to survive another month of winter. Transaction: Walgreens, $28.50. Dante clicked into the merchant details. The itemized list was available through his concierge banking app. Pediatric cough suppressant. Children's multivitamins. A thermometer. He felt a tightening in his throat. While he sat surrounded by marble and mahogany, Elena was likely in a public restroom or a cramped shelter corner, pressing a plastic strip to her son's forehead, checking for the fever that usually followed a night on a subway floor. The dangerous greed his father had warned him about was nowhere to be found. Instead, there was only a fierce maternal stewardship. As the hours ticked past midnight, the transactions slowed, but they didn't stop. Transaction: Star Market, $54.20. Transaction: Dunkin', $12.15. Dante imagined her sitting in a 24-hour donut shop, the only place warm enough to hide for a few hours without being chased out by the police. He saw her pushed into a corner booth, Leo's head in her lap, a single cup of lukewarm coffee sitting between them. She wasn't using the card to feast, she was using it to buy the right to sit in a heated room. The weight of his own wealth began to feel like a physical burden. He looked around his living room, at the $200,000 sculpture in the corner, the hand-woven rugs, and the climate-controlled wine cellar. Every object in his home was a monument to his own isolation. He had spent millions to ensure he never felt need, yet as he watched Elena spend $28 on medicine, he realized he had never felt as fulfilled as she likely did in that moment. She was a woman who had nothing, yet she was using his power to provide everything. He thought about the men of respect he dealt with daily. Men who would kill for a percentage of a drug shipment, who would betray their own brothers for a larger cut of the docks. Their greed was loud, violent, and predictable. Elena's greed was silent and sacrificial. It was a brand of strength Dante had never been exposed to in the hyper-masculine, dog-eat-dog world of the Vallo syndicate. Around 3 a.m., a transaction appeared that made him sit bolt upright. Transaction: St. Jude's Women's Shelter, $100. Dante stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the glass. He refreshed the app, certain it was a mistake or a recurring charge from a previous owner of the card. But it was real. Elena Rossi, a woman who didn't have a roof over her head and who was currently relying on the whim of a Mafia don to feed her child, had just used a portion of that unlimited wealth to give back to the shelter that had likely kept her alive during the first snows of December. Why? Dante whispered into the empty room. Why would you give it away? His father's voice, usually so loud and commanding in his mind, had no answer for this. Silvio Vallo had no categories for a person who, when given the world, chooses to share a piece of it with those even lower than themselves. According to the Vallo gospel, Elena should have been hoarding every cent, preparing for the moment the fool took his card back. Instead, she was treating the wealth as a communal resource. The digital trail wasn't just a list of purchases anymore. It was a confession of character. Dante felt the last of his cynical armor fall away. He realized that for 38 years, he had been looking at the world through a cracked lens, seeing only the shadows and the predators. Elena was showing him the light that existed in the cracks. He didn't sleep that night. He watched the notifications until the sun began to gray the edges of the Atlantic. He watched as she bought a pair of thick wool blankets at 6 a.m. He watched as she bought 2 breakfast sandwiches at 7 a.m. As the 24-hour window began to close, Dante stood up and walked to his dressing room. He didn't reach for his usual charcoal suit. He picked a simpler navy overcoat, something less intimidating. He needed to go back to the station. Not to take the card back. That felt like an insult now. He needed to go back because he realized the test he had designed for Elena had actually been a test for himself. And for the first time in his life, he wanted to pass. He pulled up his phone and sent a one-word text to Marco. Station. As he rode down the elevator, the digital trail remained open on his screen. The total spent over 24 hours was less than $600. It was the most expensive lesson Dante Vallo had ever bought, and it was worth more than every offshore account combined. He was a man of violence going to meet a woman of peace, and he was terrified that he wouldn't be worthy of the conversation. The air in Back Bay Station was just as stagnant and biting as it had been 24 hours earlier, but to Dante Vallo, the atmosphere felt fundamentally altered. He moved through the terminal not as a conqueror, but as a man approaching a sacred site. Marco and the security detail remained at the top of the stairs, acting on Dante's strict orders to stay back. He didn't want the silhouette of guns and granite-faced men to shatter the fragile reality he was about to face. He found them exactly where he had left them, leaning against the same grime-streaked pillar. But the image had shifted from a scene of grayscale despair to one of vibrant, hard-won color. Leo was no longer shivering. He was encased in a thick navy blue puffer jacket. His small hands vanished inside oversized wool mittens. He was sitting on a brand-new plaid wool blanket spread over the concrete, happily chewing on a breakfast sandwich. Elena sat beside him, her back straighter than before. She wore new boots, sturdy waterproof leather, but her thin, ragged jacket remained. She hadn't bought herself a new coat. As Dante approached, Elena stood up abruptly. Her eyes widened, a flicker of the old fear returning, but she quickly reached into her pocket. She held out the black titanium card with a trembling hand, as if it were a hot coal she had been tasked with guarding. "I didn't lose it," she said, her voice stronger than the day before. "I kept it safe. I only took what we needed to get through. I promise." Dante didn't take the card. He looked at Leo, who was staring at him with wide, curious eyes, a smear of egg on his chin. "I know what you took, Elena. I saw every transaction." Elena's face paled. "I'm sorry if it was too much. The medicine, he was burning up, sir. I couldn't wait for the clinic to open. And the shoes. His old ones had holes in the soles. I didn't mean to be greedy." "Greedy." Dante repeated the word as if it were a foreign concept. "You spent less than $600. I've seen men spend more than that on a single bottle of wine they didn't even finish. You bought life. You bought time." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "But I saw something else. St. Jude's. $100. Why?" Elena looked down at her new boots, a faint flush creeping into her wind-burned cheeks. "That shelter. They took us in when the first blizzard hit. They gave Leo a bed when I had to sleep in a chair. They're running out of formula and blankets. I had the power to help for once. I didn't think you'd mind if a little of your luck went to people who have none." Dante felt a sudden sharp pain in his chest, a receipt of grace that no ledger could account for. This was the showdown his father had never envisioned. A woman who had nothing choosing to give away a portion of a billionaire's wealth because she understood the value of a dollar better than the man who printed them. She hadn't seen the card as a way to escape her life. She had seen it as a way to validate the lives of others. My father told me that people like you were dangerous, Dante said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He said you were bottomless pits of need. He told me that if I gave you an inch, you'd take the world and still ask for more. Elena looked him squarely in the eye. Maybe your father never knew what it was like to be truly hungry, sir. When you're hungry, you don't want the world. You just want to know that tomorrow won't hurt as much as today. I don't want your world. I just wanted my son to stop shaking. Dante reached out, but instead of taking the card, he gently pushed her hand back toward her chest. Keep it, Elena. No, she gasped, stepping back. I can't. This is too much power. I don't belong with this. You're the only person I've ever met who does belong with it, Dante countered. He felt the heavy, suffocating weight of his syndicate identity beginning to slough off like dead skin. For 38 years, I've used that card to buy people's worst instincts. I've used it to fund shadows. You used it to bring light into a subway station. You aren't the thief my father warned me about. You're the teacher I didn't know I needed. He looked at the card, then back at her. The 24 hours are over, but the test isn't. Not for me. I want to know what happens if someone like you doesn't have to worry about tomorrow anymore. Elena stared at him, the card clutched against her heart. Behind them, the roar of an approaching train echoed through the tunnel, a sound like a physical weight, but between the Mafia Don and the single mother, there was a sudden, profound silence. Dante Vallo, the man who believed mercy was a death sentence, realized he had never felt more alive than he did in that moment of surrender. He wasn't giving her a gift. She was giving him a soul. Come with me, Dante said, gesturing toward the stairs where his armored car waited. Not as a prisoner. Not as an asset. But as someone who is going to help me realize that being the richest man in the city is worthless if you're the only one who can afford to breathe. The armored Maybach glided through the streets of Boston, a silent bubble of luxury that felt worlds away from the damp concrete of the Orange Line. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of expensive leather, a sharp contrast to the biting wind they had left behind. Leo was pressed against the window, his eyes wide as he watched the city lights flicker past, his new mittens still clutched in his lap. Elena sat on the edge of the seat, her hands folded tightly. She looked like someone waiting for the floor to drop out from under her, her eyes darting toward Dante every time the car hit a bump. Where are we going? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. The shelter. They'll give our bed away if we aren't back by check-in. Dante looked at her, seeing the frantic calculation of a woman who had spent years playing a game of survival where the rules were rigged against her. You won't be needing the shelter tonight, Elena. Or tomorrow. Or the day after. The car pulled up to a discreet, high-security residential building in the Seaport District. It wasn't the Ashford Tower where Dante kept his cold, empty penthouse. This was a private property owned by one of his holding companies. A safe house, typically used for high-ranking associates who needed to disappear. But as the iron gate swung open, Dante realized he was the one who had been hiding. He was the one who had been disappearing into a life of meaningless power. They took the private elevator to the top floor. When the doors opened, Elena gasped. The apartment was a sprawling expanse of soft creams and warm woods, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. It wasn't expensive emptiness. It was a sanctuary. The fridge was stocked, the beds were made with Egyptian cotton, and a fire was already crackling in the hearth, prepared by his staff an hour earlier. This is... Elena started, but the words died in her throat. She looked at the plush rug beneath her boots, then back at her son, who had already gravitated toward a large overstuffed armchair. This is your new base of operations, Dante said, shedding his navy coat. There's a room for Leo down the hall. It has its own bathroom. There are clothes in the closets. Not designer labels, just warm, high-quality things that fit. My assistant has already arranged for a private doctor to come by in the morning to look at his chest cold. Elena turned to him, her eyes shining with a mixture of gratitude and terror. Why are you doing this? I don't understand. Men like you. You don't just give things away. What do you want from me? Dante walked to the window, looking out at the dark water of the harbor. For 38 years I've been told that my wealth was a shield to keep the world out. I've lived in a fortress of my father's making, believing that everyone I met was a predator or a parasite. I gave you that card because I wanted to prove that you were a liar. I wanted to see you fail so I could feel better about my own coldness. He turned back to her, his face illuminated by the firelight. But you didn't fail. You spent $40 on medicine and $100 on a shelter while you were still sleeping on a subway floor. You showed me that I'm the one who's been living in poverty, Elena. I have billions of dollars, but I have no meaning. I have no purpose. I'm doing this because I need to know that my existence can make someone else's life better. I'm doing this to see if I can finally pass the test my father failed. Elena sank onto the edge of the sofa, her shoulders finally dropping an inch. The fortress of flesh and bone she had maintained for so long was finally starting to crack, not from pressure, but from the overwhelming weight of safety. She began to cry, not the loud, sobbing cries of a victim, but the silent, racking tears of a soldier who has finally been told the war is over. Leo crawled onto the sofa beside her, sensing her distress, and wrapped his small arms around her neck. It's okay, Mama. The man said, we can stay. Dante felt something move in his chest, a sensation so sharp and unfamiliar it almost felt like pain. It was the feeling of a human connection being forged in the ruins of his cynicism. He had spent his life protecting the family business, but he realized he had never understood what a family actually was until he saw a mother and son huddled together in a room he had provided. The card is still active, Dante said, placing it on the marble coffee table. Use it for whatever you need to get settled. I've instructed my security team that this building is off limits to everyone but me. You're safe here, Elena. For the first time in your life, you don't have to be a shield. You can just be a mother. He walked toward the door, realizing he needed to leave before he broke down. He was a don of the Volo Syndicate, a man of blood and iron, yet he felt like a child taking his first steps into a new world. Dante. Elena called out as he reached the elevator. He stopped, the sound of his name, not Don or Volo, but his name, hitting him like a physical touch. Thank you, she whispered, for seeing us. Dante nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He stepped into the elevator and watched the doors close, the reflection in the polished brass looking less like a predator and more like a man who had finally found a reason to look forward to the morning. His wealth finally had a purpose, and for the first time, the safe house actually felt safe. The boardrooms of the Volo Syndicate were not accustomed to silence, but as Dante Volo stood before his top lieutenants, the air was heavy with it. Usually, these meetings were about expanding territories, laundering clean money through construction fronts, and tightening the grip on the city's shipping lanes. Today, however, Dante wasn't looking at spreadsheets of profit and loss. He was looking at his men he had known for decades, men who lived in the same expensive emptiness he was currently dismantling. We're pulling out of the North End docks, Dante said, his voice level but brook no argument firm. And I'm selling the holding company that manages the tenements on 4th Street. Marco stood up, his face a mask of confusion and burgeoning concern. Boss, those tenements are a gold mine. The overhead is zero, and we own the land. Why would we give that up? And the docks? The Morettas will move in within the hour. Let them, Dante replied, turning away from the window. Those tenements are death traps. I saw the maintenance reports. We've been charging families for the privilege of freezing in the dark. As for the docs, the protection we provide is just another word for extortion. We're changing the model. Dante began to use his keys, his influence, his legal teams, and his vast resources to open doors instead of locking them. He spent the morning directing his accountants to move funds not into offshore shells, but into a trust for Elena Rossi and a series of grants for the very shelters she had frequented. He was dismantling the dark, piece by piece. He realized that the power he had spent a lifetime accumulating was only truly powerful when it was used to correct the injustices he had previously ignored. Later that afternoon, he returned to the seaport apartment. He found Elena in the kitchen, her sleeves rolled up, the smell of homemade pasta sauce filling the air. It was a domesticity that felt alien to the sleek, modern lines of the penthouse, yet it was the most natural thing Dante had ever seen in that space. Leo was at the table, drawing on a stack of paper with a brand new set of colored pencils. "You look different," Elena said, wiping her hands on an apron as she approached him. "The hardness in your eyes. It's fading." "I'm learning that it's easier to stand tall when you aren't stepping on someone else to do it," Dante admitted. He sat down at the table, and Leo proudly pushed a drawing toward him. It was a picture of a large, black car and 3 stick figures: a tall man, a woman, and a small boy. "That's us," Leo said, pointing to the figures. "The man is you, Mr. Dante." Dante felt a lump in his throat that no amount of scotch could wash away. He was a man who had been feared by senators and street thugs alike, yet he felt a surge of pride at being included in a 6-year-old's drawing. He realized that he wasn't just providing a house. He was being invited into a home. "Elena, I've set up a meeting for you tomorrow with a friend of mine who runs a vocational school," Dante said. "And I've cleared the deed for a small property in your name. It's not a gift from the syndicate. It's a restitution from me." "I can't take more from you, Dante," she whispered, her eyes shining. "You've already given us a lifetime of safety." "You didn't take anything," Dante corrected her. "You traded me a soul for a credit card. I'm still the one who came out ahead in that deal." As the sun set over the harbor, Dante stayed for dinner. For the first time in 38 years, he didn't check the security monitors or wait for a call about a shipment. He listened to Elena talk about her dreams of becoming a nurse, and he listened to Leo's theories about why the moon followed the car. He was a Don who was resigning from the darkness, realizing that the greatest hit he could ever execute was the one that killed the ghost of his father's cynicism once and for all. 6 months had passed since that freezing morning at Back Bay Station, and the landscape of Dante Vollo's life had been utterly transformed. The Don who once spent his days calculating the cost of conflict was now a man who spent his evenings discussing nursing school prerequisites and reading bedtime stories about knights and dragons. The transition hadn't been easy. The syndicate was a beast with many heads, and cutting them off required the surgical precision of a man who no longer feared losing his status, only his soul. One evening, as a warm summer breeze drifted through the open windows of the seaport apartment, Elena approached Dante with a solemn expression. In her hand, she held the titanium black card. It was no longer a foreign object to her. She had used it to build a bridge from the subway floor to a life of dignity. But today, she held it out with a finality that made Dante's heart skip a beat. "It's time, Dante," she said softly. "I start my residency at the hospital on Monday. I have my own paycheck now. I have a savings account. Leo has everything he needs for school in the fall. I can't keep carrying this." Dante looked at the card, the weapon of wealth that had started this entire journey. It was scratched now, the edges worn from use at grocery stores, pharmacies, and bookstores. It looked more like a tool than a trophy. "You've more than earned the right to return it, Elena," Dante said, standing up from the table where he had been helping Leo with a puzzle. "But I want you to understand something. This card wasn't just about the money. It was a tether. It was the thing that forced me to look at the world through your eyes." Elena stepped closer, placing the card on the table between them. "I know. And looking through my eyes helped you see yourself, didn't it? You aren't the man your father raised you to be. You're the man who gave a stranger the keys to his kingdom and didn't look back." Dante picked up the card, feeling the weight of it. For years, this piece of metal had represented his ability to control others. Now it represented his ability to let go. He looked at Elena, seeing the vibrant, confident woman who had replaced the fortress of flesh and bone he had met in the subway. She was no longer a project or a test. She was his conscience. "I'm keeping it," Dante said, but not in the way she expected. He walked to a small safe in the wall, not the one where he kept his emergency cash or unregistered firearms, but a small drawer where he kept Leo's drawings and a few mementos of the last 6 months. He tucked the card inside. "I'm keeping it as a reminder. Every time I think about going back to the old ways, every time I feel the expensive emptiness creeping back in, I'll look at this and remember the $100 donation to St. Jude's." Elena smiled, a true, brilliant smile that reached her eyes. "You don't need a piece of metal to remember that, Dante. You have us." The final return wasn't just about the card. It was about the return of Dante's humanity. He realized that the greatest power wasn't in having an unlimited balance but in having people in your life who didn't care about the balance at all. He had spent his life protecting his wealth from the dangerous poor, only to find that the only thing truly worth protecting was the family he had found in the ruins of his own cynicism. As he closed the safe, he felt a sense of peace that no syndicate victory could ever provide. He was no longer a Don. He was just Dante. And for the first time in 38 years, that was more than enough. 2 years had passed since the morning that Don had knelt on the grime-streaked floor of a subway station. The Volo Tower still stood tall over the Boston skyline, but the name on the glass was no longer synonymous with fear. The dark mahogany of the boardroom had been replaced with bright, open spaces, and the men in tailored suits were no longer discussing territory. They were discussing impact. Dante Volo stood at the podium of the newly inaugurated Volo Foundation Center, looking out at a crowd of community leaders, social workers, and families. Beside him stood Elena, now a licensed nurse practitioner, her presence commanding a different kind of respect than the one Dante used to demand. She wasn't just a success story. She was the co-founder of the initiative. Together, they had built a system that didn't just give handouts but provided the keys to the kingdom: education, healthcare, and safe housing for single parents trapped in the same cycle Elena had once endured. "My father taught me that power was a wall," Dante said into the microphone, his voice echoing with a newfound clarity. "He taught me that wealth was a shield to protect myself from the world. But I met a woman who showed me that power is actually a bridge. She showed me that the richest thing a person can own isn't a bank account. It's the ability to look at a stranger in their darkest hour and say, 'I see you. You matter.'" The crowd erupted in applause, but Dante's eyes were fixed on the front row. There sat Leo, now 8 years old, wearing a small blazer and a proud smile. He wasn't shivering in a thin jacket anymore. He was a child who knew he was safe, loved, and seen. When the ceremony ended, Leo ran to the stage, throwing his arms around Dante's waist. "We did it, right, Dante?" the boy asked, looking up with bright, fearless eyes. Dante ruffled the boy's hair, a genuine smile breaking across his face. "We did it, Leo. We turned the fortress into a home." The Volo Syndicate was gone, dismantled and replaced by a legacy of restitution. Dante realized that the mercy his father had called a death sentence was actually the only thing that had brought him to life. He had spent 38 years as a prisoner of his own greed and distrust, only to be set free by a woman who had nothing but her integrity. As they walked out of the center together, a former Mafia Don, a nurse, and a young boy, the sun set over Boston, painting the city in hues of gold and amber. The expensive emptiness of Dante's past was gone, replaced by a life that was loud, messy, and infinitely meaningful. The test he had designed for Elena Rossi had indeed been a test for himself, and as he looked at the lives they were changing, he knew he had finally miraculously passed. If this story of a Don finding his heart touched you, subscribe for more tales of redemption and transformation. Like and share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that goodness can be found in the darkest places. Stay tuned for our next story, where we explore how a single choice can rewrite a lifetime of darkness. The end.